We continue now at the top of Daf Peites and Beis Meseches Menachos. This is Menachos Daf 89b. The Mishnah continues with regards to mixing nesachim of various animal karbonos. You can also mix shel yom b'shel emesh. You can mix the minchas nesachim of today with that of yesterday. And Rashi explains, V'chei nami me'or v'nischei kevosim shel hayom. Let's say you have the lamb nesachim of today, b'nischei kevosim shel emesh. That can be mixed with the lamb nesachim of yesterday. Kedamrina, like we said earlier, maybe adam a person can bring his carbon today, and then the nesachim can be brought mikan ad yud yomim, from today until 10 days from now. It can be brought later, and therefore you can mix again the minchas nesachim of different days. But the Mishnah continues, aval ein ma'or v'nischei kevosim b'nischei parim ve'elim. One cannot mix the libations or the minchas nesachim of kevosim, of lambs, with those of parim and elim, bulls and rams. And Rashi explains, aval ein ma'or v'mishum dehalalu bli losan rakav halalu bli losan ava. As Rashi mentioned in the previous summit, it all depends on the proportion of the amount of oil to flour. So here the proportions are different. This one has a thinner kind of consistency, and the other one is a thicker kind of consistency, and so therefore you cannot mix those. Now, v'im bolalu elu b'fnei atzman ve'elu b'fnei atzman. Now, if you mix those bolalon, if you mix those independently, each one independently, v'nisarvu, and then they become mixed, kesherim, they are kosher. And Rashi explains, bolalon l'nischei parim b'fnei atzman. Let's say you mix the nesachim of the bulls by themselves, or l'nischei kevosim b'fnei atzman, and you mix the ones of the lambs by themselves. V'shuv nisarvu, and then they get mixed together, ksher, and they are kosher. However, v'im nisarvu ad shelo bola, but if they get mixed before the actual, if they get mixed together before the mixing of them, then psula, then they are disqualified. As the Mishnah continues, imad shelo bola, if it gets mixed together before the mixing, then pasul, then it is disqualified. And the Mishnah continues, Hakeves haba im ha'omer, the lamb that comes together with the omer, afal pisha minchaso kefula, even though its mincha is doubled, but lo hayu nesachav kefulim, but the libations are not doubled. And Rashi Ksaviyat explains, v'im bolalon elu b'fnei atzman, if you mix them on their own and then they got mixed together, meaning shekvar holchem mitzvahs belila shamno, at this point, the mixing of the oil with the flour, that mitzvah is already completed, so then ksherim, if it then gets mixed together, even if it's different consistencies, it's kosher, that's kirabanan, that follows the opinion of the Rabbanan, to pligi oled Rabbi Yehuda, the Rabbanan who argue on Rabbi Yehuda b'hakometz rabba and hakometz rabba, v'amri, because they say, chorev shenesarev b'bolol yakrov, let's say you have a dry mincha, it gets mixed with a mincha that's mixed with oil, that can be offered. Now, v'imad shelo bolol, if before the oil was mixed with the flour, they get mixed together, nisarvu, they're mixed together, again, this is talking about minchas with different consistency in terms of flour and oil, psulos, then they're disqualified. The ba'inan ro'i labila, it has to at least be fit to be mixed together. Veleka, we don't have that. The chasera shel keves v'shalayil yaser, because you have too little with regards to the lamb and too much with regards to the ram. And afal pisha minchaso kefula, even though the mincha is doubled, this is talking about the mincha by the omer, kedechsib be'emor la kohanim, like it says in Parshas Emor, u'minchaso shnei esronim, it says the mincha is 2 isaron, and the point over here is, even though the flour is doubled, but still the nesachim, which again refers to both the oil and the amount of wine, that is not double, it is a quarter of a hin. And the Gemara asks, Uriminu, we have a contradiction against our Mishnah from the following brisa. The pasuk says v'hiktiro, and he burns it, and the brisa learns from that pasuk shelo ye'orev chalavim b'chalavim, that the sacrificial parts of a carbon should not be mixed with the sacrificial parts of another carbon, and the same should be true by the nesachim. How can one mix the nesachim? And the Gemara continues and answers, Amar Rabbi Yochanan says, im nisarvu ka'amar, it means to say, if they get mixed. And Rashi explains, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, lo teima ma'orvin lechatchila, don't say that our Mishnah means one can mix it lechatchila, it's not really appropriate. Ela im nisarvu kamar just means if it gets mixed, it's okay. V'hada katani v'hiktiro, and when it says v'hiktiro that you shouldn't mix, that just means shelo yarev lechatchila mari, that means that lechatchila one shouldn't mix, and so therefore they are perfectly consistent. But the Gemara continues, Yachi, if so, ve'ein ma'arvin nischei kevosim b'nischei parim ve'elim, our Mishnah goes on to say that we don't mix the nischei kevosim, those of lambs, with the nischei parim and elim, so va'afilu nisarvu namilo, that would mean that even b'di'evet, if it got mixed, it would be problematic. It's not just lechatchila, because our Mishnah is talking about im nisarvu, it's talking about after the fact. But that's problematic, v'hamidukatani seifa, because in the end of the Mishnah it says, bolalon elu b'fnei atzman ve'elu b'fnei atzman, if they were mixed, meaning the flour and oil were mixed independently in both of those, vinisarvu, and then they get mixed together, so ksherin, shemen, then it's kosher. And so therefore the end of the Mishnah clearly is talking about a b'di'evet situation, an after the fact situation. Mechlal dereisha lechatchila kamar. Doesn't that imply that the beginning of the Mishnah is all talking about lechatchila, that even in the first place one is allowed to mix, and therefore Rabbi Yochanan's answer does not seem to be correct. And so the Gemara continues, Amar Abaya says, Hachi kamar, this is what the Mishnah means to say. Me'orvin yenon im nisarev sultan v'shamnon. One can mix their wine if the flour and the oil was mixed. And Rashi explains, Amar Abaya says, Vadai reisha demasnisin detani me'orvin lechatchilahi. Really, it is correct what you're inferring from the end of the Mishnah. The beginning of the Mishnah is talking about me'orvin lechatchila, that one is allowed to mix lechatchila. And so now we're back to the question from the Brisa. The Brisa seems to be saying one cannot mix chalovim b'chalovim. But v'lo tikshilach, that shouldn't bother you. That's not a question. The nisarvu nisachim demasnisin, because when our Mishnah says the nisachim are being mixed, and again we interpreted the Mishnah as talking about both the oil and the wine, but actually biyenos kamari, we're talking specifically about the wine. V'hachi kamar, and this is actually what our Mishnah is saying. Ma'orvin yenon shel nisachim parim ve'elam lechatchila. One can mix the wine libations of parim and elam even lechatchila, but that's only im nisarev kvar sultan v'shamnan me'alein, if already there was a mixture of their flour and their oil, and that happens. And so now hoel v'hischil arif, since there was already a beginning of a mixture of the two, leka mishum lo yarv lechalavim. So then there's no problem of lo yarv, that one shouldn't mix chalavim with chalavim. V'hadetani aval ein ma'orvin nischei kevasim b'nischei parim. Now, when it says in the Mishnah one should not mix nischei kevasim and nischei parim, that's afilu heichad nisarev sultan v'shamnan. That means even in a situation where their flour and oil was mixed, but still the wine should not be mixed. But the Gemara continues and asks, V'yenon lechatchila lo, is it really true that the wine lechatchila shouldn't be mixed? It's only if the flour and oil get mixed together, then the wine can be mixed together. Is that really true? Rashi explains, V'yayin lechatchila lo, afilu de'elim uparim, even by the rams and the bulls, im lo nisarev sultan v'shamnan, let's say their flour and oil was not mixed. Still, is it really true then the wine can't be mixed? V'atanya, but we learned in a brayso, as we're about to see, Ba'med devarim amurim de'en ma'or v'nischei kevasim v'nischei parim v'elim. When is it true that one cannot mix the nisachim of the lambs with the nisachim of the bulls and the rams? Bisolas v'shemen, that's by the flour and the oil. Aval yayin ma'arvin lechatchila, but the Brisa says that wine can be mixed lechatchila. Bein nisarev salta v'shamno, bein lo nisarev, whether the flour and oil was mixed or not. As the Gemara continues and brings the Brisa of Tanya, but we learned in the Brisa, B'amed devarim amurim b'solas v'shemen. When is all of this true? As Rashi just said, it's with the flour and the oil. Avol yayin ma'arvin, but the wine could be mixed, and so then again we are back to the question. It says that chalovim should not be mixed with chalovim, and it says in our Mishnah that one can mix, and that seems to be even lechatchila. And so the Gemara continues, Elo amar Abaya, rather Abaya says, Hachi kamar. This is what the Mishnah is saying. Heichad dehuktar sultan v'shamnon, in a situation where the flour and the oil was burned, ma'orvin yayin lechatchila, then the wine can be mixed lechatchila even in the first place. Heichad de lo hukta, but if it wasn't burned, then im nisarev sultan v'shamnon, then only if the oil and if the flour and the oils have been mixed, ma'orvin na miyenon, then the wine can also be mixed. V'imlav ein ma'arvin, otherwise one can't mix. Dil ma'asi la ruve solas v'shemen lechatchila. And the reason why we don't allow the mixing of the wine in that situation is we're afraid one will come to mix the flour and oil lechatchila, and so therefore there's an element of total lechatchila by the wine as well, but also an element of the wine only being mixed when the solas and shemen have been mixed, and so therefore it's not a contradiction. That's the same idea, that there is an element lechatchila of not mixing, shelo yayarev chalavim b'chalavim. And Rashi explains, Elamar Abaya, rather Abaya says, Heicha dehuktar kvar sultan v'shamnan shel porim ve'elam k'mitzvasan. If the flour and oil of the bulls and the rams was burned properly, then morev nami yayin lechatchila, then one can mix the wine lechatchila. Deleko lemechash dil masi leruve sultan v'shamnan. Now there's no concern someone might come to mix the flour and the oil. Debnei haktara ninu v'ika mishum v'hiktiro shelo yayarev chalavim b'chalavim, because again those are things that are burned on the mizbeach, and there's an issue issue of lo ye'arev chalavim b'chalavim, sharei kvar mu'uravin v'omdin, because they're already been mixed and they're standing ready to go. V'im la, but if not the lo ukter, if it hasn't been burned, sultan v'shamnan, if those have not been burned, ein ma'arvin, then one can't mix. The chayshinan dilmasi le'ruve solas v'shemen lechatchila. Then already we're concerned one might mix the flour and oil lechatchila, to usher that, as we said, is prohibited. Shlo ye'arev chalavim b'chalavim, like we said in the brisa, one doesn't mix the sacrificial portions. V'had katani brisa aval yayin ma'arvin, when it says in the brisa wine can be mixed. Hainu im hukter salt and v'shamnan, that's if the solus and shemen were burned. V'had katani mitziyazet demasnisan aval ein ma'arvin, and when it says in the middle of the Mishnah one does not mix, hainu b'shalon isarvu salt and v'shamnan, that's when the solus and the shemen was not mixed. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. The Mishnah said keves haba im ha'omer, that's the lamb that comes along with the omer. So the Mishnah said even though the flour of its mincha, its accompanying mincha, is doubled, but that does not mean that we're going to double the nesachim. Again, that's with regards to the oil and the wine. And the Gemara says, Tanu Rabbanan, the sages taught in a brayso, uminchaso shnei esronim, it says that its mincha is 2 esaron. Limed al keves habo im ha'omer, this teaches with regards to the lamb that comes together with the omer, sheminchaso kafula, that its mincha is kaful, it's got double the amount of flour. Now, yachol kashem sheminchaso kafula kachiyeno kaful. One might think just like its mincha is doubled, so too the wine should be doubled. Talmud Lomer, the pasuk says, v'nisko yayin revi'as hahin. It says that the yayin, the wine of libation, is a quarter of a hin. Now, yachol lo yeheyeno kaful. Now, one might think that the wine should not be doubled, she'eno nivlalim minchaso, because one doesn't mix the wine with the mincha. Aval yeshamno kaful, but maybe the oil should be doubled. She'nivlalim minchaso, because that is mixed with the mincha. Talmud Lomer v'nisko, and we learn from there kol nesachav, all nesachav, including the oil as well, lo yehu el revi'as. It should only be a revi'as, a quarter of a hin. And the Gemara continues and asks, my Talmud, what is the derivation of this brisa? And the Gemara answers, Amar Belazar says, Ksiv vinisko, it's written vinisko with a hey at the end, Vikarinan vinisko, but it's read vinisko as if it has a vav at the end. And so Keitzad, how so? What's the interpretation of that? Nischa de mincha means that the libation of the mincha, meaning the oil of the mincha, kinisko diyayin, that's like the nisachim, that's like the libation of the wine. And we compare the two, and that's what the brisa is saying. Ma yayin revi'as, just like the wine is a quarter of a hin, avshem nami revi'as, so to the oil, it is a quarter of a hin. And the Gemara continues, Amar Rabbi Yochanan says, Asham mitzora, the asham that is brought by a mitzora, by a leper, sheshachtu shelo lishmo, let's say it was slaughtered but not for its own sake. The general halacha is, when a carbon is slaughtered shelo lishmo, so it is still brought, it doesn't fulfill the owner's obligation, but it's brought as that original carbon. Now what's unique about an asham mitzora, different than a regular asham, is an asham mitzora has an accompanying minchas nesachim. And so Rabbi Yochanan says, in this case, when it's shelo lishmo, ta'on nesachim, it will still require those nesachim. Shem iyat ta'omer ken, because if you don't say that, pesalto, then it's going to be disqualified. You can't switch this to some other carbon. It has to remain designated as an asham mitzora, even though the mitzora will need to bring another carbon to fulfill his obligation, but it's still the same carbon fundamentally, and if it is the same carbon fundamentally, it still requires those nesachim. The Gemara continues, Maskeflar of Menashe Bar Gada, of Menashe Bar Gada asked on this, Alamayat, according to that logic, Keves habo im ha'omer, what about the lamb that comes together with the omer? Sheshachtu shelo lishmo, that was slaughtered shelo lishmo. So we should say the same logic, Tei minchaso kefula. That lamb in general has double the amount of flour in the mincha, and that should remain the case. The mincha should have to be doubled. From the same logic, Shem iyata omer kein pesalt. If you don't say that, it's going to be disqualified. This is a unique carbon. It is a unique carbon ola, and so therefore that accompanying mincha would have to have the same rules. And the Gemara continues and says, V'tamid shel shachar, the same thing is true by the morning carbon tamid, which also is a carbon ola, but it also is unique. Sheshachtu shelo lishmo, for that was slaughtered not for its sake. Yehiton shnei gezirin b'kohen echad. There's a requirement that 2 pieces of wood need to be brought by 1 kohen for that tamid shel shachar. That requirement should still be there. Shemiyat omer ken, because if you don't say that, pesalto, you've disqualified it. And similarly, v'tamid shel bein harbayim, the tamid of the afternoon. Sheshachtu shelo lishmo, for that was slaughtered shelo lishmo. Yehiton shnei gezirin b'shnei kohanim. That should require 2 pieces of wood from 2 kohanim. Again, that's a requirement unique to that carbon, even though it's a carbon ola, but it's different than other carbon olas in that regard. Shem iyata omer kein pesalto, and if you don't say that, then one has disqualified it. And the Gemara says, in yes hachinami, indeed that is true. According to Rabbi Yochanan, we would extend his halacha, even though he said his halacha by Asham and Sora, but we would extend that to the keves haba im ha'omer, and we would extend that to the tamid shel shachar and the tamid shel bein harboyim, in the way we just described. Elamar Abaye, and rather Abaye says, Chad minayu nakat. Rabbi Yochanan just chose one example, but there are several examples. And the Gemara continues, Rabbi Abba Amar, Rabbi Abba says, some have the gears here of Rava Amar, Rava says, Bishlama hanach olos ninu. I understand, in these cases, it's actually different than the Asham Mitzorah, because they're all example of carbon olas, and we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Tzadi Amid Aleph.